Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It is awesome to be coming to you today to talk a little bit about advanced qualitative research considerations. And building from our podcast from last week, we are going to just dive into this idea of quantitative research and quantitative methodology as a means to really understand organizational based research. And so we have a couple of objectives today, really to review and go back over some of the stuff that we talked about last week. We want to revisit the idea of experimental and quasi-experimental design, and then talk about analyzing quantitative data for organizational performance. Specifically, we're going to talk about effect size today, and understanding what is an effect size and how do we use that in organizational research. So, without further ado, I want to dive back into this idea of quantitative methods. And remember from our lesson from last week, quantitative research is an empirical approach that involves the direct or indirect use of data, oftentimes that is numbers, to draw conclusions about a population or a sample. And if you remember from last week, we talked about the differences between a population and a sample, and how sometimes within an organization it's just not feasible to survey everybody or to put everybody through a research procedure. So we get a sample of that population and then we generalize out. And there were a couple of different ways that we can go about getting that sample. We won't go back through that today, but I would encourage everybody to take a look at that and just review from last week how we differentiated between those things. But moving forward, remember with us that quantitative research is one kind of an empirical approach that often involves the direct or indirect use of data. And particularly for quantitative research, that is oftentimes numbers. Moving forward, remember that there are a couple of different types of methodology. There's non-experimental, causal comparative, correlational, descriptive, and then we did talk about experimental and quasi-experimental design. Remember that we mentioned experimental is where we control for variables like a treatment and a control group. So there would be one group that would get the treatment, there would be one group that did not get the treatment, and we would attempt to the best of our ability to control for any confounding variables that might get in the way of actually seeing if the treatment worked or if the treatment was predictive for our outcome. Quasi-experimental is often used in organizations to do research because it's pretty laborious and time intensive and can be financially constraining to do pure experimental research. And there are also some ethical considerations when it comes to pure experimental research. And the example we gave last week, if you remember, is which one of us would like to volunteer to get paid less money? So let's say we were doing a rewards and motivation study. Which one of us within the class would volunteer to be in the control group that didn't get paid more money, but or which one of us would want to be in the treatment group that didn't get paid more money? So sometimes experimental research can be a little tricky inside organizations, but quasi-experimental takes existing conditions such as an already pay for performance reward scale or some type of a treatment like an orientation program or some type of a training and development initiative, and we look at that in terms of its experimental design and using things that are already embedded within the organizations. I would encourage everybody to take a look back at their textbook to just kind of revisit this idea of methodology and some of the different ways in which people go about collecting research information within organizations. As we move forward, one of the things that we need to consider is how do we make meaning of the data? So let's say we have this great methodology, we have this great design, we go out to find things and we collect some data, and so we found something, but what does it actually tell us? Well, there are some ways and some techniques that we can use to really understand our results. So one of them is R, which is Pearson's product correlation coefficient, and that tells us the strength of a relationship. And then R squared, D, and the confidence interval really does tell us the magnitude. So if you think about the Pearson product correlation coefficient, it really does indicate degree of strength, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the rest of these, R squared, Cohen's D, and then confidence intervals, really tells us the magnitude of that relationship. Take a look at our text and kind of dive back into that a little bit deeper to best understand how effect sizes are utilized. But again, we'll talk about this in a moment and give some examples about how effect sizes get used. But for now, just knowing that they're there and kind of what they do is enough information for the purposes of our conversation right now. If we move this forward, remember that we can talk a little bit about experimental and quasi-experimental design, and we can take a look specifically at pages 82 and 86 of our text. What's important to know here is that there are limitations depending on your design methodology around internal validity, external validity, frame of reference, and longitudinality. All four of these are explained within our text. The question we might consider is how can we use this kind of a design within a particular company or within a particular kind of research purpose or design? Knowing that experimental is sometimes laborious and outside the realm of a realistic cost framework, and quasi-experimental, it takes existing programs that are currently involved. We want to understand the different types of design, and our textbook goes into great detail about these. I'd encourage everybody to look deeply at our text to see exactly what they're talking about here and their application to research inside organizations. So moving that idea forward, knowing that there are different types of design, one of the things that we need to talk about is this idea of multivariate analysis. Now, I think someone brought up the idea last week of, well, I think we were talking about job satisfaction. And we said, well, there are a couple of different things that can actually affect job satisfaction. It's not just one magic thing that controls for all of the different variations that of job satisfaction that one person might be able to feel. And so this really gets into the crux of multivariate analysis. I want to introduce that idea here, and then I want to move on into some other things. So the idea here is that we know that variable x, our independent variable on the left-hand side of our screen, variable a, that was labeled previous weeks, does affect to some degree this idea of job satisfaction or the dependent. This is our kind of hypothesis, that there's something that has an influence on job satisfaction. Now, there could be a bunch of different things that we could put here. And if we were to make a list of these things, it actually might end up looking a little bit something like this, where there are a bunch of different factors that we think actually might affect someone's feeling of job satisfaction. So it could be their pay or their coworkers or a supportive supervisor or support for growth and development. It could be a bunch of different variables. And if we were to take a realistic picture of what are the things that actually affect job satisfaction, again, we would make quite a list. And we could actually, if we were to make a list as a class, we could think about all of the different things that affect this idea of job satisfaction. So I'm going to pause here. I want to come back and visit this as a standalone podcast and really kind of dig down deep into the idea of multivariate analysis. But for the purposes of this particular podcast, I think understanding that there are different types of design methodologies, particularly within quantitative design, that it's not just enough to know that we found something statistically significant, but we also need to know its effect size, and knowing that there are variables that can actually affect there are independent variables that can affect our dependent, and that oftentimes it's not just a relationship of one-to-one, but actually it's perhaps a combination of those variables. Within an organization, that's very important to know, because as we're looking to move the needle on some type of a performance outcome or turnover or some kind of very specific thing that's contextually sensitive to our organization, there are lots of things that actually influence human behavior. Knowing that going into a research study helps us to frame up and better understand what's going on. Until next time.